Hello, and welcome to Regrets I've Had a Few. I'm Paul Hunter, Artistic Director of Told by an Idiot, and this is a podcast where I talk to friends and colleagues delving into what made them the person they are today.
Hello and welcome. My guest this month is equally at home on the stage or in the world of music, and she's a truly captivating presence. Whether making her own solo work in the show Elephant or appearing in acclaimed award-winning musicals such as Jesus Christ Superstar and Oklahoma. I was lucky enough to share the stage with her earlier this year at the Almeida Theatre in Omar Alarian's production of Rhinoceros, and it's a delight to welcome Anoushka Lucas. Hello, Anoushka.
Hello, Paul. What a lovely introduction. Thanks.
You're very welcome. It's really nice to see you. I'm going to kick off. We've got lots to touch on, I'm sure, but I'm going to kick off as I always do with my guests and ask you about the memory you might have of your first theatrical experience, what you remember of encountering performance, seeing it was it with family or school or whatever? What was that?
This is a great question. I have two, and I need
Ah,
to know which one came first. But um, the first one is going to Regent's Park Open Air Theatre
excellent.
because our this story's got a bit of a clang at the end of it. But our neighbours who lived three doors down, they had two kids who were a bit older than us, and their dad was in a show at Regent's Park.
Excellent.
We got tickets to go and see him, and he was in The Music Man. And I actually don't remember the show at all, but I remember the seats outside and being so shocked that I must have been quite little and being so shocked that there was a theatre inside a park and that you could still see the trees, but that there was a stage and people were going to come down. And it's only years later that I pieced together that my neighbours' friends, their dad is Brian Cox. So it was actually like probably a very good performance, but I don't remember it because I was about 6. But the one I do remember vividly is maybe a couple years later, I think. My parents were like, "Oh, we're going to go into town, into London, so we need to put our nice clothes on." Um, which we accepted for some reason, my sister and I. So we put our nice dresses on and we went into Soho, and we were walking down a big street in Soho, and we happened to bump into our godparents, and we were like, "God, what are the odds of this?" And they were like, "Well, we have tickets to Oliver at the Palladium." And then it turned out it was all a big ruse from our parents. And I must have been about 8 or 9. And I remember properly understanding what was going on and understanding that the people on stage were actors pretending to be the characters that I knew from the movie so well, because I loved that movie. And I was just obsessed with Nancy, who had this red dress. And I just remember leaning forward because we were in the circle and wanting the feeling that was on stage to come into my body. It's really vivid.
Wow. And do you remember anything in retrospect about who you saw, who was playing Fagin or?
I think it was quite it's quite a famous production. It was at the Palladium, I think in like 1990, somewhere between 1996 and 1998. So I wonder if because Rowan Atkinson did one, didn't he? He played.
Oh, yes, he did. Yes,
I
yes, you're
think it
right.
might have been that one, but I actually had never looked it up because I didn't want to take away the
No, why should
sort
you?
of like physical memory a bit.
Yeah, and you were having quite a visceral experience by the sound of it in your connection to Nancy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And am I right when we chatted before that you grew up in a house that was quite performative or certainly quite musical?
Yeah, I had my parents met because they were both trying to be sort of half-heartedly trying to be pop stars. My dad's a drummer. My dad was a drummer. He went to art school, learnt to paint, and then came out of it a drummer. And was in a series of bands, and then moved to London, and then went into a rehearsal studio one day and saw a beautiful woman going into the rehearsal studio next door, and that was my mum. And my mum came over from France and actually had got headhunted to join a band because she answered the phone for her then boyfriend. She had a very thick French accent, and her German boyfriend was a pop star, and then his manager was like, "Who was that who answered the phone?" And then the sort of manager said, "Well, she's got a really sexy voice. Why doesn't she join a band?" And so then my mum got put in a band where she mostly just recited things in French. And that's how they met. And they did that for years. They had a sort of punk pop band called True Life Confessions, which was like just quite. There's a lot of pictures of my mum in like Girl Scout outfits covering my dad in ketchup. I'm quite glad I didn't see it. And
Can I just
we
ask
were
one
born
second? I'm very intrigued by your parents. This sounds extraordinary. What kind of period are we talking about? Is this the 70s or?
in the 80s. I met in 1981. And I was born in 1987, so across the 80s. And they did, they supported The Clash. Yeah, there's a famous family story about how they were almost put on top of the Pops and then somebody bumped them. So they were sort of hovering on the peripheries of success for about 5 or 6 years.
That's a
And
good
also,
title for your
yeah, I
autobiography.
think so. I mean, it's also very related. They had a child who did a similar thing. Um, and yeah, and they were also living a very sort of free rock and roll lifestyle, a lot of wild parties and sort of, they were not, even when I was growing up, they were not conventional parents. When I was at school, I went to a posh private school because I got a scholarship. So I went to a private school in West London, and everybody else's parents worked in the city, or the mum didn't work. And, my parents, by the time they had a few kids, they were like, we're not gonna cut it on this sort of free rock and roll income. So my dad became a painter and decorator, and my mum became a French teacher, but all of their friends were musicians and artists. And the
Wow.
sort of behavior, cannot give away my parents' secrets on the internet, but like,
No, you couldn't.
behavior at
And
parties, sometimes I'm like, oh, that was just, I mean, my nickname at home was Safi after the character in Ab Fab, which I think is a good
I
insight.
think that's very good. So, so am I right in thinking that in terms of your own connection to performance, so you've talked about seeing performance, was your first introduction to performing yourself more music than it was acting?
Yeah, well, my dad was in, but my mum sort of, in quite a classic gendered way. My mum stopped when we were born. I'm the eldest, and then my sister was born 3 years after me. But my dad didn't. So my dad was, working in the day, but was still in a few bands. So my first memories of performing and watching my dad on stage, we would go and see my dad gig in pubs and church halls and small venues. And so it was bands, yeah, it was all bands, and a lot of his friends were in bands, and so I saw, and also I think there were, like, everybody knew quite famous, successful people, but the bands that my dad was in and his friends were in were not famous, successful bands. So I also had this idea from quite early on that there is this whole ecosystem of musicians, and it's not just the ones that you see on Top of the Pops who are out there doing it, and that actually you can sell out a gig to 200 people in Putney and nobody knows who you are. So I think it was really, yeah, and I grew up definitely around that. We would see my dad perform, like, I don't know, a few times, definitely like once a month at least, I think.
That's quite an interesting. It sounds like quite an interesting introduction to performance in quite a grounded way, really. The sense that it's not all about fame and showbiz. There is a sense of an ongoing gigging, playing, performative thing.
Yeah.
And that feels quite a because a lot of people don't have that. They have a perception of performing as being this glamorous thing that a few people get to do, sort of
Mm.
thing.
Yeah, I think it was really, it was my dad's, he's a complicated man, but he's an extraordinary man, and he sort of my cultural landscape, the first 20 years of my life, my dad's sort of main task, I think, that he took upon himself was to make us as culturally curious as possible. And in retrospect, I'm so grateful that he was like, oh, you've got to listen to Randy Newman, and here's Jeff Buckley, and also let me take you to see Erica Badu, and then we've got to go to the Tate, and then I've got to take you to the Serpentine Gallery. And there was, from a really, because also we didn't have very much money.
Mm.
And I think from a really early point in my life, it was really clear to me that you made art to make art, like not to make money, not to be famous. Although you could also, there's also like the people who did get famous, who made money, were visibly having a different experience to my dad and his friends, and there were some attractive things about that. But there was very much art for art's sake is like what I was raised in, and I think I'm so grateful for that as a as a grounding as I've gone through my own career. I've been doing this variations of what I do for 15 years now. And I think the fact that I came from a house that was like, it's worth doing even if you're not making any money, has really stood me in good stead through very dry periods.
No, I'm sure it has, and it sounds like a wonderfully, as you say, your dad curiously cultural growing up. So you go through school, and at what point does performing in a more of a kind of the music obviously is continuing and all that. At what point do you start to think about the notion of, oh, I quite like to be a performer? Does that come later at university, or how does
So
that?
singing, I wanted to be. I started playing the piano when I was 7,
Uh,
and first we had a little Casio keyboard, and my mum always said, we had like a 2-octave Casio keyboard, and I started messing around on it when I was about 5. And then by the time I was 7, my mum was like, "Oh, she's quite into that." And so some friends of ours gifted us their old piano.
wow,
And so then we got a piano in the living room, which was quite a big thing in our flat was small. At that point, there were 4 of us in a 1-bedroom flat when we got it. And then
wow,
did that.
and then suddenly you get a
And
piano
then
as
suddenly you
well.
get a piano, and the piano was like very clearly my thing from nobody. My sister played, but she was never that into it. And so I started playing when I was 7, and then when I was 14, I think because of my dad, being like, listen to Tim Buckley, listen to, Josephine Baker, or Hoagie Carmichael was very big in our house. And the notion of songwriting was really close, and it was completely demystified. So I just started writing songs when I was 14, and I just really didn't think anything of it. I was like, oh yeah, great. I've got feelings and I've got a piano, so I'll just write a song. And my parents, I guess around that time, I got enough feedback from people. First I only played it to my parents every now and again, but also I would spend hours in my living room just playing the piano on my own and
Wow,
singing. And then I got enough feedback. People were like, "Oh, that's quite good. You sound good, and your voice is nice." And I'd already sung. I sang when I was 10 years old. I sang "Crazy" by Patsy Cline, a one of my dad's friends' bands at their big 50th birthday party. And I was like, "Oh yeah, this feels nice singing in public." So I just thought, "Great, I'll just write loads of songs, and then I'll be Adele or Amy Winehouse. How hard can it be?" And that was my plan. So I started gigging. There used to be this night called Clappy Hour at a place called the Dance Attic in West London, where I grew up. On Saturday nights, they used to put these sort of variety nights on, and from about 13, I would sing 1 or 2 songs there. So I was really used to singing in public. And then when I was 17 is the first time I gigged my own songs. Is that true? Yeah. And then I remember the second gig I got paid, and I was like, "Oh, right, okay, this is quite nice." And then I went to university, but university was sort of a trade with my mother, who, my mum didn't finish school, and as you heard, had quite a precarious 20s, and she was, she sort of turned into a classic French mother when she raised us and was like, "You will receive the education I didn't receive." So we had to go to university, and we weren't allowed to do music or anything artistic, mostly because I think in our family, it's always been like, "Well, if you're gonna do that, you're gonna do that anyway. It doesn't matter."
okay. So in a sense, your university time was a bit of a departure into something else,
Yeah.
in a way.
And then and also at university, I found university quite stressful, and I disappeared into music. So every time I had to write an essay, I would end up writing a song, and I was always doing singer-songwriter nights. And then I came back to London when I was 21 with a completely useless degree in Russian and Italian, and was like, "Right, I'm gonna be a singer and a songwriter, and I'm gonna try and get a record deal." And that was the plan. That was the plan, and I was, the naivety of youth. I was like, "It'll probably take, like, 1 or 2 years, and then I'll win a Grammy." So then I set out, and I put a band together, and I had a residency at, like, the Troubadour, and I was playing upstairs at Ronnie Scott's, and I was playing in these really lovely venues.
Wow, Anushka, this is fantastic. So this is you out of university, you're playing those kinds of venues.
Yeah, 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 and I was really like, we had a little following, and this is also the dying days of CDs, so I made a whole bunch of CD
Yeah, of
EPs
course, yeah,
that
yeah.
there's no trace of on the internet, and I was selling my CDs, and And I got, to be honest, quite horribly close to a record deal a couple of times.
Oh
Well, it was
gosh.
really painful for little Anoushka. So I met some with Sony and then Decca. And
Oh wow, that's extraordinary.
yeah, and it was happening and then it wasn't happening. And I wanted it so much, Paul. I was like,
Yeah.
gotta, and I wanted it so much that I didn't really notice that I was developing a career in theatre alongside it because that was like my side hustle.
And was that to bring in? Is that? I mean, that's astonishing that you obviously were, able to get that close to that kind of thing and be part
Yeah,
of that
like,
performative world. Wow, I didn't realize that. That's amazing. I could have seen you. I spent a lot of my time in Ronnie Scott's. Perhaps
well, I was usually upstairs when.
I often go upstairs as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
I don't just go
Yeah, well, so
exclusively
then, yeah, you
downstairs.
probably did see me. There was one time I had a residency there, so I was playing there once a month for, like, 1 or 2 years when I was 23,
Wow,
24.
that's amazing. But let's talk about what you refer to as your side thing, which is your theatre. How did that come about? Was that meeting people like Shay Walker,
Yeah.
or
Shane
that feel
Walker.
he feels quite a formative theatre relationship for you?
Yeah, he was instrumental. So I was sort of bumbling around trying to be famous singer, and, a friend of my mum's was running a masterclass at the Riverside, and she said, "Oh, will you come in?" And Che was writing a musical for this masterclass in the summer, and we met. We actually, I don't normally tell people this, but actually she asked me into audition, which I didn't really understand. And I went into audition and I was really bad at that point because I didn't know what acting was. I thought you had to pretend to be someone else. And I never tell anyone this. At the end of my audition, Che said, "So you're clearly not an actor. So what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a songwriter." And he said, "Oh, well, there's a piano there. Why don't you play me a song?" So I played him a song that I'd written. And then at that point, Omar Lightfoot was attached to write the music. And then he got distracted. And then I got a phone call like 2 weeks later saying, "Hi, do you remember me? I'm Che Walker. Um, will you come on board and write the music for my show? I think your songs are really good." And so that's how it started. And then we ended up writing a musical that got picked up by the Bush that never went on. And then Che had a show on at the Globe. So he was developing a musical, and he got me into the workshops for that. And then when it went to the Globe, they needed a piano player in the band. So he was like, "Come and play the piano in this musical at the Globe." And Matthew Dunster was directing it. And this is like 2013. And I had never, I remember being on stage. Well, I remember being on stage and Matthew Dunster saying, "Can you come downstage?" And me being like, "Where's downstage?" And I didn't know my ass from my elbow, but I was so excited by two things. The first was I was getting paid every week. Singer-songwriter is unheard of. Like, you just make no money as a gigging
No,
musician, 'cause also
no, I'm
part
sure.
of
I'm
running a
sure.
gig, once you've done the rehearsal, paid for a taxi to carry your keyboard there, paid musicians, you usually made a loss. And then I was like, "Oh my God, when I play in the band of a show, I get £600 a week because the Globe is generous." And the other thing was, I thought the actors were so cool. I was like, "These are the coolest people I've ever met in my whole life, and I want to be all of them."
But I think the two things you say there that interest me. One is I can totally relate to what you're saying about, the fact that, a gigging musician must be really difficult. And a good friend of mine is a jazz pianist called Zoe Rahman, and
Oh, yeah, he's a
yeah,
great
and
pianist.
she's a wonderful pianist, and her husband is a jazz drummer, and they've got two kids. And I always think when I see Zoe, I always think sometimes when I think, oh God, theatre's hard, I think at least I'm not a jazz musician.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're really correct.
No, I mean, I always go, I think it's hard. At least I'm not a jazz musician or a poet.
Yeah,
It could be
I
harder.
think
Do you know
a
what I mean?
poet is the most difficult one. Or
However, it's interesting you say that you thought the actors were cool. I always feel that when I think of musicians, that's really cool. And a while ago, a taxi driver looked at me and said, "Oh, are you a musician?" And I felt really pleased with myself. I felt so proud that he'd obviously looked at how I was looking, and he thought, he's obviously a musician. I almost lied and went, "Yeah, yeah, I'm just off to do a
I
gig," but
have
I
to
didn't.
say, though, having been on both sides, my experience is that all actors secretly want to be musicians and all musicians
Yes,
want to be
I'm
actors. Like,
sure.
I
I'm
think we
sure
are the
that's
closest cousins because we're the two of all the well, the
yeah,
dancers as well, but the fine artists and the poets and the photographers are all over there, and we're all performing.
yeah.
Like,
I
we're
think
like,
you're right, and I think that there's a little burning thing there, even if you just want to look like a musician.
yeah,
I think also when you mentioned the Globe, what I always love when I've played there is obviously how brilliantly adaptable and fluid the musicians are. Like
Mhm.
you go on stage to warm up, and then someone will say, "Oh, we've got someone depping on drums tonight." And then this person is absolutely amazing and just
Yeah,
sat
yeah,
in and
yeah.
played. And I suppose as someone who loves spontaneity, I love that about musicians that they can often just go, "Oh, yeah, I can play that." And you think,
I feel
how on earth do you do that?
theatre musicians are like, I'm making an album at the moment, and I'm going into the studio in 3 weeks to record horns and strings on top of my own stuff, and half of the musicians I've hired are theatre musicians because they're so reliable, and they're so good, and they're so used to being called up and being like, "Can you come and dep this gig at 6 p.m? I'll give you the notes," and then they play it fantastically with, like verve.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's theatre musicians are, you know
I'm often in envy of that when I'm in shows, and it's true. So you get this introduction with Shay, and then obviously that becomes a thing that takes you further. At what point do you start thinking, "Oh, I'm maybe going to get an agent and go for auditions as an actor"? How does that happen?
that was a complete accident as well. Jay and I wrote a musical called The Etienne Sisters that was on at Stratford East,
Mhm.
and it was like a chamber musical. Nicky Yo, the jazz pianist, was the pianist in
Oh,
our show,
wow.
and it was a three-hander, and I was MD and composer. Shouldn't have been MD, but didn't know that then. And we got a casting director who was a musical theatre casting director called Will Burton, and we ran auditions, and then he took me out for lunch, and he was like, "Why are you not in the play?" And at that point, I was about 26, 27, and I was like, because I don't act." And then I remember he was like, "No, you can act." And I was like, "I can't act. I haven't acted since I was in a school play when I was 11." And then he said, "Can I put you up for auditions? I think you could get a part." And I thought he was just really funny. So I was thinking, "Yeah, you can put me up for an audition if you like. I don't know what I'm doing." And then about a year, he called me up and was like, "There's this or there's that." And I was like, "No, no, no, I'm trying to make my album and like, this is silly." And then one weekend, I'd just broken up with my boyfriend. I had nowhere to live, and I was working in a dress shop on the King's Road, and I was so depressed. And my phone rang, and it was Will Burton, and he said, "Listen, they're looking for someone to play Mary Magdalene in Jesus Christ Superstar who's not a traditional musical theatre actress. Will you come in?" And I don't think if I hadn't been that depressed, I wouldn't have said yes, but I was like, "Yeah, fine. I mean, what have I got to lose?" And then I got it.
It's a brilliant story, and also doesn't it bring us full circle to Regent's Park? Was it that where
Well, exactly,
there
yeah.
we are. There we
Ended up performing first at the first theatre I ever went to. Well, the first theatre I remember. And, yeah, and that was a real baptism of fire, but it was amazing. And I went in I had 4 rounds of audition. Andrew Lloyd Webber approves every single person who's in
Oh
it.
my god, really?
Yeah, yeah, he gets fun.
Wow. At what point do you meet him in the audition process?
Didn't meet him, they just sent a video off to him,
Oh,
but I went
okay.
4 times, and, I remember the first time, I prepped because I was like, "Oh, this is serious." But I also in retrospect, I think a lot of um, uh, my advantage was that it wasn't my world, and I didn't really care
Yeah,
if
that
I
is
didn't get
so
it.
true, Anushka, I think. Someone said to me, about performing in general, that for them, performing is giving a shit and not giving a shit at the same time.
Yeah,
And I think when you, on one level, don't really care, there's an immense liberation.
I miss that now because I've been doing it for 10 years. But now I'm an actor, but the first, like, 3 or 4
Yeah.
years, I thought it was funny that people kept giving me jobs because I didn't think I was any good, really, and I also still was, finishing an album and trying to get a record deal, and I think about the rooms I went into and the people I met without knowing who they were because I got signed by pretty good agents immediately, And there's a couple auditions that I think at and still wince at how unprepared I was. I also think that that lack of care was such a superpower at the beginning
Yeah,
of my.
definitely, definitely. So obviously now you play this astonishing part. It's very acclaimed, and you go on to do more of that. But there feels like a point in which you're kind of the two worlds merge in a very maybe a more personal way with the creation of your own show. How did that start to manifest itself? Or when did you start thinking about I want to do something that's
Well,
about me?
I hate to say this, but that again was somebody else's idea.
Ah,
But one thing that happened after Jesus Christ Superstar was I got put up for a lot of musicals,
yeah.
and quite quickly I was like, I don't think this is the world for me. Um, because I think actually to be in musical theatre, it helps to have musical theatre training. Like I'm a fine dancer, but I'm not a good dancer. And I also, I started acting 10 years into performing and performing my own stuff, which means I think you probably can relate to this. Like
Mm,
it means that I was used to having a certain amount of creative control at
sure.
what I did and what the thing looked like. And a lot, particularly musical theatre, can be quite prescriptive. And I just shrink in an environment like that. If you tell me where to stand, what to do, and how to deliver the line, I will become quite a bad actor quite
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I need to try and move into straight theatre, which means I need to learn how to act. So then for a few years, and actually, this is related to Elephant. The first person to put me in a play with music, but not a musical, was Lynette Linton at the Bush. In her first season, she put me in a play called Chiaroscuro, where I had, a bunch of songs, and it was really beautiful music. But I also had 50 pages of dialogue and a nervous breakdown and a monologue. And I was like, okay, let's see if I can actually do the thing. And I was fine. I wasn't great, but I was fine in that. And then from then on, Lynette and I became quite close friends because that was her first Bush. And also, we're both mixed race women. At that point, we were both in our sort of late 20s, early 30s. And we were making, I mean, she was higher up than me, but we were both sort of ambitious in making a name for each other. We always say that we're also both Capricorns. And so she and I sort of got on really well. I stayed in touch. I did a few other things at the Bush. And then in the pandemic, George Floyd got murdered, and there was this massive explosion of the Black Lives Matter um, moment. And the Bush reached out to me and 4 other writers of color and said, "We'd love for you to write a response piece to this in digital form because all the theatres were closed. It needs to be 10 minutes long. We'll give you £100. Do it in 5 days." And so I sat down to write a song, thinking that I would write a song about sort of the experiences of racism in my life. And then I realized that like what was starting to come out was how, because I'm light skinned and because I'm middle class, I've always felt like I can't really talk about racism because it doesn't impact me in the way that it impacts darker skinned members of my family or more working class members of my family. But then I was like, well, hang on, the reason with me not talking about it, what that means is it suggests that it's not active in the middle classes in the way that it is in the working classes. And all this really complex stuff came out, and I was like, I can't fit this into a song in 4 days. So I wrote a speech alongside the song, and I sent it to the Bush, and they put it up, and it went viral. And it got like 35,000 hits in one day. And then they came back to me the next week, and they were like, "There's just been an extraordinary response to this. Have you ever thought about writing a play?" And again, Paul, it was the pandemic, and I was close to being broke. And they were like, "We'll give you a few grand if you write a play." And being the chancer that I am, I was like, "Yeah, all right. I mean, how hard can it be? I'll write a play." But it took me 2 years. The maths didn't add up because that money did not last for 2 years. But um, but yeah, that's how I wrote a play. And then it was really, from quite early on, I was like, I don't want to write musical, and I also don't want to write something. I've seen a lot of one-person shows, particularly amongst my generation, that don't go very deep below the surface. And I was like, I want to write a play that just happens to have one person.
Now, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I really do.
Thanks.
Because also that, I think, inevitably, when you look at it like that, then you open up much more theatrical
Yeah,
possibilities. You're not
exactly.
restricted by the sense, "Oh, it's just me." It's looking at it right from the very beginning creatively as a bigger thing is a
Yeah.
yeah.
It was really, and that's been extraordinary because I've come back to it 3 times now, which I really didn't expect when I was writing. When I was writing, like, but it was the first time I was making it, so I was like, maybe everyone's gonna be like, "This is shit." Um, and so the reaction was really it was bigger than what I expected, and it's had a longer life, which I'm really proud of. But I've also been able to come back to it 3 times across 4 years, and each time, the work that I've done in the interim has really informed how I
Of
do
course.
it.
Of course. And it's interesting when you say that, the returning to something, it fascinates me because obviously we hopefully return to something because people are excited by it.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the returning to something is so I'm gonna go back to what your dad said as well about the curiosity. I think for me it's always an opportunity to re-examine what it is rather than just put it on again.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a chance to go, oh, does that still work? Or should I look at it like this? Or and it's great to have the opportunity to look at something again, isn't it? And see what changes and how it moves on, I suppose.
I think I learned that on Oklahoma was a big learning curve for me because it's the longest stint I've ever done. We did 3 months at the Young Vic, then it was a hit, so it went to the West End, and then we did
Yeah.
7 months in the West End.
Wow. God, the whole year with that show. Wow.
Yeah. So I essentially did a year of my life on that show, and I mean, a whole year of my life also actually happened, so I had to do it when I was happy and when I was sad and
Yeah.
when I was annoyed, but also, you're not protected in the bubble of a show when it lasts for that long. But the other thing is, like, I learnt so much about the necessity of curiosity in performing. Because as soon as you're bored, the audience is bored.
I totally agree with you.
And so I
Totally
think,
agree.
there was a bit there was a bit in the middle where I was having like a terrible time in my personal life and everyone was quite bored of the show. And there was a bit in the middle where we sort of lost it and then we got it back. But on a solo, on a personal level, I had to be like, I have to find a way to still find this interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is and it's interesting once you acknowledge that to yourself,
Yeah.
that actually I've got somehow this has to be reinvigorated, otherwise it's going to be not very pleasant for me or
Yeah.
anybody else.
And also,
I think also,
go on.
Anushka, as we come towards the end of this lovely conversation, I think you're also a brilliant example of something I really admire, and it's not always easy. Is that sense of following your nose, following your instinct, not being pigeonholed. We have a culture, certainly in this country, where
Yeah.
people tell you what you should do. I get it a bit as someone who directs and acts. Over the years, people will say, if I've been in something as an actor that they like, they go, "Oh, you should just focus on your
Yeah.
acting."
Isn't that funny?
And if I direct something the other way, I think you should. And I think, well, no, I think one informs the other, and you're a fantastic example of that with what you do with your music, your writing, your performing. It's been so lovely chatting to you. We must do it again over a glass or a cup of coffee or something soon. But I'm going to wind up by something I always do, which is to ask some rapid fire
Oh,
questions.
okay.
Which you just give your first response. There is no right answer.
Okay.
Some of these questions are based around my experience of getting to know you. So some people might know, why has he asked a weird question to ask, but you might. The first question is Alan Titchmarsh or Monty Don?
Monty Don.
Excellent. Very definite. I remember from my Nostros rehearsal, uh, observing you, you always seemed a keen partaker of the biscuits that were on
Yes,
offer.
thank you very much.
So I ask you, digestive or hobnob?
Hobnob. That question
Yeah.
goes out to Joshua Maguire.
Excellent. I now go a little more highbrow with
Okay.
Nina Simone or Aretha Franklin.
Oh, Nina Simone.
Wonderful. Portobello Road or Camden Market?
Or Ridley Road Market, I'm afraid.
Excellent. I like that. Severance or Succession?
Severance.
I knew that. This is about movies of musicals. So
Okay.
movies of musicals. West Side Story or Evita?
West Side Story.
The new one or the old one? Or
Oh, do
both?
you know what? I held off watching the new one for a long time, but it's just as good. But
Very good.
old one for my own sake.
Excellent. And finally, an escape room or a Turkish bath?
Definitely a Turkish bath.
Excellent. Anushka, it's been an utter joy.
Thank you so much
I
for
hope
having
you,
me, Paul.
not at all. I hope you have a lovely rest of the summer and let's get together soon.
Yes, lots and lots of love. Speak soon. Bye.
Last name, bye, Anushka. Bye bye.
Dear listeners, if you've enjoyed this idiot podcast, please spread the word